Good, thank you. We are live. Caleb, welcome. We're just going to give a couple minutes for folks to make their way in. Welcome, Robert.
Honey,
Hi, Alma. So maybe Odo will go to 103 and then we'll kind of work through we got some kind of background housekeeping stuff, but I don't want to delay it too much. So we'll give another minute for folks to come in. Hey, Mark, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
It's a pleasure. Welcome, Eric.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon. Okay, well, let's give a couple more seconds. All right, well, why don't we pull up our slides and we'll kind of slowly work our way through some background and allow some of the other working group members to come in. So just as a reminder, Ben Duncan, I'm here to help support the process. Although largely today, you all will be really interacting directly with the Odo team and the CETI team. But if we go, so just welcome. It's good to see folks. Great to be back in the room together. If you want to go to the next slide. I'm not going to read the Odo mission. I think it was presenting on last time, but just wanting us to center and ground ourselves, particularly in the language that's connected to the mission to advance solutions and shape an equitable clean energy transition. And certainly the overlay with environmental and public health benefits are really key aspects of that mission-based link to the work that and expertise that you all bring into the space. We can go next slide. And we are on a WebEx platforms. Odo, I'll just ask you, since I don't use this very much, if I miss any kind of key components, let me know. But it shows some of the areas that are likely most useful as we go through this conversation. So you can see on the bottom left is the mute, kind of bottom of your screen, mute and unmute. If you click on that, the arrow also has settings to your microphone, speakers, etc. Right next to that is the stop video button, so start and stop. And again, we'll just ask folks as much as possible to stay on video today, at least try to create the feeling of being together in person. The chat function is depending on your kind of your view is at the bottom right corner. And I'll just note that, we do have chat available, but we are, asking that you have some level of etiquette, right? So we don't want to have kind of virtual side conversations in chat, but certainly using it for asking questions and raising issues or sharing resources. And then you do have a raise hand button, again, on the bottom of your screen next, and then some reactions, emojis. I just ask folks always be delicate with emojis. They don't always mean what you think they mean to other people. So certainly if you want to send a heart because someone's sharing something beautiful, that's wonderful. But, googly eyes, sad eyes can look like side eyes and some, not always, commensurate with what you think is going to happen, but certainly raise hand to get in the queue. If folks are or end up on the phone, use, I actually don't know if you're on the phone. Is it *9, Odo, folks? Do you know? Like how you raise your hand? Oh, use *3 to raise and lower your hand if you're on the phone for WebEx. Any questions for the technology? Okay, last thing I'll just note for any public meeting, if you do use chat, unless it's a technical question, please, you can, who's our technical lead for today, Odo? Who should they reach out to?
you're gonna reach out to Abby.
Abby, so if you have a technical issue, just go to your chat. the to line can go to Abby. Otherwise, please change it to everyone. So there's visibility for the public audience. And let's go to the next slide. So there's a couple hopes, and this should hopefully feel familiar to you all, but just really centering and grounding us back into the purpose of this work group really is centered on hearing the priorities for EJ and equity within the strategy, identifying and understanding where the opportunities are to evaluate, analyze equity and environmental justice effects on these different pathways that we'll be working towards to meet Oregon's clean energy objectives. And then, specifically, expertise and feedback to inform that broader evaluation. And so just note where we are in this process is on modeling, right? Which is kind of a technical aspect. And certainly as we move into early 2025, the conversation will go from kind of that modeling analysis into more of the policy conversation. So that's just drawing a distinction. I know it's easy to get kind of focused in on policy, so we'll just remind you a lot of today's conversation and the work that other work groups and you all are having discussions around are really focused on that modeling analysis. And then just if we go to the next slide, supporting, again, how we're going to seek to create a constructive, productive conversation. We offer these group agreements as a way to move in that direction. So, you all, did a great job in our last conversation, really sharing some space. But, again, as we continue to have dialogue, listening to each other, right, listening to understand, not just to respond, encourage constructive, helping to move the work forward, but certainly being candid, being frank, and bringing the wisdom, expertise, and perspectives that are the reason you all are around this room. We do ask you keep an open mind, right? Explore, be curious, ask for why. Respect that, while you all represent some similar interests, you may have very different perspectives based on any number of lived and professional expertise that you bring into the space. To the extent that you all are grappling with differences, to the extent that you can resolve and seek common ground, it lends power, credibility, credence, whatever the words are, for Odo, right? The guidance that you offer is really important and really critical to moving forward. And to the extent that you all are saying the same thing together, there's a power in that. And then finally, just asking folks to really be sensitive and mindful of how much space you're taking up. And certainly, that's an ask for each and every one of you to be mindful and self-aware. But that's also something that I'll be, really paying attention to, and we'll sometimes ask for folks to bring in perspective or ask folks to maybe step back a bit and call on or invite other folks into the space. So again, we offer these as a way to ensure that our space that we create and cultivate together is one that can lead to productive, constructive conversations. And then let's walk through our agenda, and then we'll ask you to put some introductions in the chat and then really dive into the substance of our conversation today. So we'll create some space for some reflections from the last meeting. We will get an update on the timeline. So if folks are really grounded in the work that's happening in the short term. And then we have some dedicated time together where you'll hear from Ruby Moore Bloom from Clean Energy Transition Institute, CETI, Elaine Hart from Moment Energy Insights, and Ruchi Sudhir from Odo, really grounding you all in the energy modeling, some of the different scenarios, the assumptions that would be a foundational element, and then some of the potential alternative scenarios that your expertise and wisdom would be really valuable for. We'll do some future, talk about some future opportunities to engage more deeply in the work, wrap up, and get you out of here by 3 o'clock. So, Odo, anything to add in terms of the agenda? Lauren, did you want to offer anything in addition? Okay.
No.
Perfect. So let's, if we go to the next slide, we're not going to go around the room because we do really want to maximize the time that we have today. But if you could, at least in the chat, again, to everyone, put your name, affiliation, pronouns, if you choose to share, and then one of your favorite areas to spend time in Oregon. This will be my vacation planning for the next year. So get some good ideas. Like, where's your secret, secret swimming holes, all that stuff. Okay. So thanks for doing that. And Lauren, I'll pass it to you. And largely to the folks today, like, as I said earlier, you're going to be in a really direct conversation with the CETI team and with Odo, Oregon Department of Energy folks. And I'll kind of step in as it's helpful, but really wanted to make sure you all had a lot of direct intersection and interaction. So thank you for modeling in the chat. And Lauren, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Lauren Rosenstein. I'm the Community Equity and Inclusion Analyst here at Odo. Edith is on leave this week. I'm going to be joined by my colleague Ruchi today, who's going to be helping to facilitate some of our conversations. I wanted to start with our word cloud that we all did last time. So we can hop to the next slide. Oh, sorry, there's all of our working group members. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. Last time we were together, we filled out this word cloud, and I know some of you may have missed it. You're always welcome to pop into that QR code, and you can add to it now. I'm bringing this up to ground our conversation today in your purpose. I noticed that justice is the biggest and the centered word here, so I want to call that to attention. And I also wanted to name collaboration, representation, accountability, and visionary. Those were some of the words that really stood out to me. As we move through our time together today, I really encourage you to root into your purpose and also recognize the purpose of your fellow work group members. We can go to the next slide. Last week, there was a lot of great conversation. We've unpacked a lot of information. These are just 3 of the points that I wanted to reflect back. I hear and Odo hears that there's concern and uncertainty that the current disparities will not change in the energy transition. There's also an identified need to distinguish between single family versus multifamily and renter versus homeowner as we're thinking about the energy wallet. And there's an interest in understanding how granular the approach can be because there's regional differences that people would like to approach. And those regional differences are in needs across the state. The example came up around using rural as a blanket term because it doesn't feel distinctive enough when looking from the coast to Eastern Oregon. Next slide. We also heard that there's a feeling that this process is going very quickly. And with that, there's concern that there's not enough space and time to understand the model to be able to provide meaningful feedback throughout the process. So we're going to take time today during this meeting to discuss how you all would like to engage in this work throughout the process. For now, we're going to move into taking a look at the timeline. We're going to work to provide some clarification and dive into some conversations. I'll be passing it over to Ruby from the Clean Energy Institute and Elaine Hart from Moment Energy Insights and Ruchi Sudhir from Odo, who's going to help to facilitate this portion of the conversation. I also wanted to say that last time we were all together, y'all used the plus signs and the hearts and the thumbs up, and you came off of camera when you could, and that was all really awesome, and I think helped to build a really, a juicy conversation. It was lovely, and it also really helped Odo to see where there was alignment and where maybe we needed to have more conversations. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Ruby.
All right, thank you, Lauren. I'm Ruby Moore Bloom. I'm a technical project manager for this project, and I'm with the Clean Energy Transition Institute. So like Lauren said, continuing on this theme of slowing down a little, understanding the modeling analysis, and then really trying to be clear about where the opportunities for feedback are and the timing around those opportunities. So you can go to the next slide. I'm starting with a visual representation of a few different pieces of this analysis, which will then help understand how the timing aspect fits. So starting with what you see here, the energy modeling is really the foundation for the entire technical analysis. And that's what we're working to set up right now with feedback from working group members, as well as the advisory group and others. And we're trying to get input in that red box up top, feedback on the reference scenario assumptions and what priority scenarios or what if questions we might model. And that is all input that goes into the energy modeling. At a high level, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but at a high level, the energy modeling is calculating the energy needed to power Oregon's economy, and then the least cost way to provide that energy while also meeting clean electricity and emissions goals. Next. So once the energy modeling is complete, we have results, and that will happen later this fall. And those results then feed into subsequent analyses. So that will happen later in the winter after the results are complete. So one of those analyses that we talked a little bit about last time is the energy wallet. And so the energy wallet is examining energy expenditures, so energy spending and energy burden for different customer types, and also looking at how the timing of investing in electrification can change or can impact customer costs. And so here, the feedback that we'd be looking for is help defining those customer groups. So the example that Lauren brought up about rural and rural Eastern Oregon being very different from rural coastal Oregon, that type of feedback is going to be really useful as we try to define those customer groups. And we've also heard that there's a little bit more guidance needed to understand exactly what types of inputs we're looking for the energy wallet. So we'll definitely provide more guidance a little later down the line once we get to that stage. And then next. So the second piece that comes out of the energy modeling results is air quality modeling. This takes the energy modeling emissions results and calculates the impact of reduced particulate matter on health outcomes and economic benefits. So we had some questions last time about the level of geographic granularity, and that's a conversation we can have. There are some limits to what the modeling can produce in terms of what level of local air quality modeling, but that is some feedback that would be great to get from you all as well. On a completely separate track, you can go next, Mary. There is geospatial mapping, and this mapping is not coming directly from the energy modeling results, so it's on its own timeline. There is a lot of really rich discussion that we look forward to having here, but we want to make it clear that that does not have to happen on the same timeline as the feedback for the energy modeling. So we know we didn't have enough time to fully get into this in the last meeting, so we will make time for this later. But the mapping exercise will explore community level energy inequities and the relationship to socioeconomic disparities. So we'll be looking for feedback on what are the highest priority indicators that people would like to see in this map. Some examples might include energy burden, percent of mobile homes, projected wildfire risk, percent of individuals without health insurance. That's just an example, a sampling. Mariah has created a list of, I think, 47 indicators so far that are very much open to feedback and input. And then next, the mapping is hopefully going to be really helpful during the policy conversations that will be held in early 2025. And so because there are limitations to what the energy modeling and the subsequent energy wallet and air quality modeling can really tell us in terms of geographic granularity, just based on the way the models are set up, we're hoping that the mapping can help us interpret those results and guide conversations around where investments might be targeted or might be best targeted with an equity lens throughout the state. So I'll pause here and leave this visual up if there are any questions about how these different pieces interact. And I'll talk more about the energy modeling itself later on, so maybe hold if there are questions about that, but just in terms of the general schema.
Nikita, you want to jump in?
Yeah, your last point, Ruby, about holding off on energy model. I don't know if this question is
Right.
an energy modeling like specific question, but so maybe you'll get into it. But I'm wondering what the connection is. So I see the arrows from the modeling going to energy wallet and then air quality modeling. So they seem like separate. Those are like separate tracks. How do those and how do those results interact with each other? So the energy wallet and the air quality monitoring, how do those scenarios carry over or like overlap? Yeah, is there an arrow that should go between those two boxes? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think so. I think of them as separate kind of sets of results that tell us different parts of the whole story. And so the energy wallet is much more focused on taking however we just define it, a particular customer group and looking at how the spending changes over time between perhaps increased spending on electricity, but lower spending on gas. And so it's going to be a set of graphs showing how that would look in the different scenarios that are modeled. And then the air quality modeling will be a set of results around lower or avoided deaths, lower hospital admissions, fewer days of work lost. And so I think that together they help kind of flesh out the whole technical analysis, but I don't, at least right now, see the interactions between the two of them, and one does not feed into the other in a technical way.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. They don't overlap. One's about how much money gets spent on your energy bills, and the other one is the larger air quality shed. So as we shift away from sources of energy and be that coal, natural gas, gasoline, diesel, that create criteria pollutants like PM10 and other kinds of criteria pollutants. As we shift away from them, we get reductions in those criteria pollutants. US EPA has a model called COBRA, which then takes that and calculates what Ruby was saying, all those different aspects of benefits that occur: lower deaths, lower mortality, lower hospitals, lower work absenteeism, and creates a value of that. And they call that that's the benefit. Unfortunately, we really only have these two equity kind of metrics to deal with in that are accessible and quantifiable.
There's one thing to add also. So the economic benefits piece of the air quality modeling, which is there on the screen, that is translating those health outcomes into their economic benefit. So what is the economic benefit of not missing as many days of work or not having as many hospital admissions? So that economic benefit is on an economy-wide scale, whereas the energy wallet is looking more at an impact to a customer group.
And to add one more point to that, about scale of these, the air quality benefits that occur, the health benefits that occur often in these models actually are greater than the energy saving value that happens. So like when we did the TIGR analysis, the health benefits were more than the energy savings benefits. And other models that SETI and Evolved have done has shown the same results, where the air quality reductions creating health benefits outweigh the energy benefits by shifting to lower cost and more energy efficient equipment. So it ends up being a pretty big deal.
a follow-up question. So okay, I understand. Yeah, I think in my mind that my question around how those two interact is because I see them as very connected. Or I that's how I thought of them, as like investing in electrification and moving and transitioning away from fossil fuels. Obviously impacts people, like has impacts to people's individual wallets as well as air quality and emissions. So I think I was equating them, but I think it's helpful to understand that energy wallet maybe is more as a result bucket, more individual and like household level, which I think you just said, Alan. And air quality is more like the air shed in general. So I think that distinction, if that's correct, is helpful.
You got it.
Yeah,
You got
that's
it.
great. I think there could also be, at the risk of putting too many arrows on this slide, we could have arrows at the bottom all feeding into the policy conversation. So that's where I think it would make sense for them to interact is, yes, you're taking the results from the air quality modeling and the energy wallet and you're coming back together.
That's super helpful. Yeah, okay. That makes sense. Yeah. So they're not, the modeling isn't like the scenarios don't overlap, but like the policy implications definitely do. Which is what I was
Yeah.
thinking.
And just to be clear about what the model can and cannot do, the model's not going to be explicit as to where these reductions in emissions occur. It's going to be airshed level. So you won't be able to say, you know, Portland metro area or Eugene or Redmond. It'll be the Oregon airshed. So unfortunately, we won't be able to get to location specific because the model isn't that granular.
Mm-hmm. And Alan, when you say the model in that case, you mean the EPA COBRA model specific to air quality that's using the EPA kind of airshed designations. Is that right?
No, the model that Evolve has.
Oh, okay.
Well, if it did, we could plug it into the EPA model and the EPA could calculate that, but we don't get those kind of results to plug into the EPA model.
Gotcha.
Cool.
Except for the fact that Evolved is using COBRA when it's COBRA that they use. They're applying the COBRA model for the air quality modeling.
Yeah, just on the whole state.
Right, exactly.
So I'm just going to reflect that back because I was a little lost myself. Thanks for raising it, Nikita. So the EPA kind of defines some of these airshed pieces, and the Evolved model, which is where it says energy modeling, uses that as one of the sort of ways to distinguish different air quality kind of zones, maybe you could call it, in the state. And then there's some outputs based on the various scenarios. Each of those outputs has an energy wallet and an air quality modeling associated with it to give us a better understanding of how each of those scenarios might affect individual sort of customer groups in the energy wallet and those kind of airshed zones in the state through the air quality modeling. Did I kind of reflect that correctly, Eileen?
Almost. I think it's more that the zones are defined first in the energy modeling, and then that's the limitation. Like Alan said, if we had the ability to model, if the energy modeling were at a census tract or neighborhood block level, the EPA COBRA model could take that and give us those results at that level. But the energy modeling is right now going to be set up for 2 zones of Oregon, and so that's likely what the air quality modeling would reflect as well. Jeremy's not on, but I think there is potential for some discussion around that I don't think we need to get into right now. But there are also limitations to what the air quality modeling can tell us, or how accurate those results feel when we get to more geographic granularity that is not based on the energy modeling.
I saw Caleb's hand and Sarah's hand too, so I wanted to sort of check in with them. But Nikita, did you have any other sort of follow-up, or do you want to hold on the follow-up? How are you feeling?
No, I feel good for now.
Okay.
Thanks for the questions.
Thanks for all that. In the process of that conversation, I had several more questions come up and they all got answered. So we're off to the races here. One of the things that I wanted to ask is regarding the policy conversations in early 2025, how is that going to fit with like the budget schedule? Because agency budgets are going in now. Governor's request budget is already going to be set by then. Can someone just speak to how all that will fit with the legislative schedule?
Yeah, I can start and welcome others to kind of weigh in. I'll be the first to admit that having policy conversations during a legislative session might not be optimal, but that is kind of where we are in the timeline. And so there might be some, conversations happening in the Oregon energy strategy, working, the policy conversations after the modeling that you will feel are familiar based on maybe what you're hearing or working on with legislators or advocates. And I think that's okay as long as we can kind of acknowledge that and surface that. And luckily we have Kearns and West on the line to sort of help us with that facilitated process. And then to your question specifically about budgets, which is a major part of, I think, our work in the long session, DEQ, a lot of other agencies as well. The policy conversations that we'll have will be captured in the report that goes into the legislature after session ends. So if they were to be actionable, it would be in the following session, is my understanding of the timeline. Does that help, Caleb?
Yeah, it does. Thank you for that, Rishi. I guess then my follow-up question would just be, does that undercut the need to move this so quickly? Or does that buy us more time, or am I just off base there?
No, we're going to be working off of the statutory deadline of the energy strategy legislation, which is also, part of how this project kind of was implemented and the timeline created. What you're learning in these spaces and what we're learning in these spaces, I think will be useful for you in many other ways. And so I don't think you need to sort of feel held back. We want to create a space here where we're all learning. And that is something that will be super helpful for the energy strategy project. But, if you're learning something that's helpful in other parts of your work, we welcome that. And we're going to be doing the same as we learn. I just learned the difference between air zones, for example. So,
Richie, can I jump in on that to add a little more?
Mm-hmm.
Everything Richie said, so one of the things that we're trying to accomplish right now, why this is so rushed in this moment, this part of the process, is that we have a modeler ready to go and they have a certain schedule in which they need to work, and that we had already worked with them to help push that out by a month, but this is kind of where we're at. We can't push it any further because they're scheduled to work on other things after they're finished with this. So we do have to get through this process pretty quickly, but we're really open to how we can build a less stressful timeline when we get to the policy discussions later on. So just one more piece of information.
Yeah, and I would add to that Caleb, the way that we built the schedule was we started with the deadline and then we worked our way backwards, all the pieces, parts that need to occur, and including getting Kearns and West and SETI Evolved on board and doing all that process, the paperwork, and figuring all that out. And then layering on top of that, like Jessica said, the availability of the consultants who can do this work is what created the timeline.
That's all super helpful. Thank you all.
Sarah, I think I saw your hand up too.
Yeah, thanks, y'all. I wanted to say that this visual for me is super helpful. And I wanted to but I still wanted to clarify a couple of things just to make sure I'm interpreting it correctly. So the pieces that have feedback are feedback that are specific for this group too. So that would then mean that y'all are looking from this group for feedback on the reference scenario assumptions and priority scenarios that go into the energy modeling. And I just wanted to clarify that the energy modeling here is referring to like what I think was called before like the energy pathways model. And so once that modeling is done, that's going to then feed into these other kind of models that are not more relevant, but what this group is focusing on. Is that?
That's how I understand it, Sarah. So I'm not nodding, but if anybody wants to add anything else, I think you reflected that how I would too.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Richie?
I don't see any others, and
Okay, well, that question was a good segue into the next slide, which just has some timeline information. So that exactly what you said, Sarah, the input that's requested from this group on the energy modeling is assumptions on the reference scenario, which we'll talk about today, as well as the what if scenarios, which we'll also talk about. And that feedback is all requested by the end of August. So that's the one that is on the more compressed timeline. And then the energy wallet and air quality modeling and geospatial mapping, we have a little bit longer because we still need to get them set up to be ready when those energy modeling results are done, because those will then feed in. But we're putting October as the time there. At the end of this meeting, Lauren will lead a discussion about how people want to be involved in those conversations. So that's why there's not like a specific date there, and we don't have the exact mechanism, because we wanted to have that be a discussion with everyone. But this is the kind of mapping the timing onto that previous slide of where the feedback comes in and how the various pieces interact. Any other questions on timing? All right, we can move to the next slide. I'm now going to move into a few slides explaining the energy modeling approach. If you were at the first working group meeting, this will likely be familiar, or if you were at the listening sessions, but I think it's good to remind everyone of what is a very complex modeling exercise, and that will set us up well for the questions that we're going to be asking afterwards. So next slide. This is another fun visual to help explain what the model is doing at a high level. So starting on the left, the model is calculating Oregon's current economy in the residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation sectors. It's calculating the energy needs of all of those sectors through electricity, transportation fuels, and direct use fuels in that middle box. And then it's calculating the energy supply to meet those needs in a low-cost way, in a way that maintains reliability, and in a way that meets energy policies. And so that end result there is your least cost energy supply. And again, that would be constrained by any of the clean energy goals that are incorporated. Next slide. This is the same idea, but just in a more detailed infographic. So you can think of that middle row of the energy modeling. That was what was represented on the previous slide. Again, starting on the left with a model of current and then future energy demand, moving to the tool that calculates that future energy supply across electricity and fuels. And then all the way on the right there, you can see costs minimized and a greenhouse gas emissions pathway as part of the results. The bottom row represents all the data that's going into this model. So the modeling tool and evolved energy research has been used in many, many places all over the country, including for the Washington 2021 state energy strategy, as well as other states like Massachusetts and California, studies with nonprofits and utilities and universities. So Evolved has this database that they use that's based on publicly available and verifiable national data sources. But we've spent the last couple of months meeting with key data holders in Oregon to try to replace aspects of that national data set with more specific Oregon-specific data wherever possible. So there are data sources for demand side subsectors as well as on the supply side. And then on the top row, that represents assumptions that are going into the model. And these are based on policy as well as our best guesses about what the future world might look like. And this is a really key area for input and one that we'll get into pretty specific questions on soon. But you can see some of those would be like the emissions target is already set by policy. And next slide. One of the main features of this modeling effort is the comparison between a reference scenario and the additional scenarios. So for the reference scenario, we are developing, as I mentioned, an Oregon-specific database and defining certain assumptions.
Hey, Ruby, if you mind
yeah.
going back one slide.
Go for it.
Jess has a question about the GHG emissions pathway and what that means.
That represents, or that means a set of results that will show emissions in each year increment, so in each 5 years from now through 2050 to meet those emissions targets.
5-year increments. And then maybe unrelated, but connecting to our previous conversation about the sort of 2 zones in the energy modeling, where does that show up in here for air?
Yeah, so that would probably be, it would actually show up in the assumptions and the data, I think. It would show up in the data in terms of we need data to define those 2 zones. So I know that there were conversations in the transmission and distribution working group about that. And then you could also consider that an assumption. We are assuming 2 zones in Oregon. Maybe it's more of a data question, but yeah, it would be in that input into the modeling. And then it would also affect those results you see on the right in terms of the energy supply pathway, because those results you'd be able to see broken out by the 2 zones.
And that's relevant for air quality because in the 2 zones, we would over time see, as an example, less emissions from transportation in these various zones, or some other sort of energy supply options that have effects in those 2 zones. Is that
right?
Connecting it correctly? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then Ale has a question about where they could find the details of the energy demand pathway, like those 80 subsectors.
Yeah, the place that's off the top of my head, I can put it in the chat in a little bit. It's the Evolved Energy Research produces an annual report called the Annual Decarbonization Pathways, or ADP. And it's the place that has the most detailed technical documentation of their model, but it's not going to be specific to this project because we're still working on all of the documentation since we're, it's ongoing, but I can put that link in and it would show you details about their model as it's currently set up for their national work. And I'm pretty sure that like the demand subsectors would be the same. That's not something that would change.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And if you're not a modeler, read it and you're having trouble sleeping, this is a great thing to read.
Oh, thank you, Elaine.
So one of the things about those far right outcomes, the greenhouse gas pathway and the cost and the supply. So on the next slide, that gets calculated for each one. It gets calculated the reference scenario, and then we change it, and it by each of these 5 scenarios, and we get different results. And what we're trying to do then is compare when we change something back to the reference scenario to see what happens. So you can then illuminate the trade-off, costs and benefits that occur by different kinds of pathways or different kinds of circumstances. Like what if we have constrained transmission and we can't get renewables to load, or if we don't have EVs adopted at the same kind of thing. So the far stuff on the right of that previous chart is the stuff that will change in each one of these scenarios that we can compare back to reference.
Yeah, I think so.
So the model doesn't give you it doesn't give you the answer. It gives you the context to create the strategy. And the policy implications of that are, so if we know that this particular scenario increases the health benefits or decreases the health benefits, maybe we want to think about that in terms of a policy and prevent that from happening.
Thanks, Alan. I'm going to pass it back to Ruby to move through this slide.
Yeah, you can go next, Mary, so that it shows the second part of this slide, which is what Alan was just alluding to, the scenario development. So each of those 5 circles around the reference scenario changes something from that reference scenario so that we have a point of comparison, like he was just talking about. This is an opportunity to develop a set of interesting questions in collaboration with Odo and with all of you to understand what are the most pressing questions and uncertainties and state priorities that we want to explore. And we are refining to 5 scenarios to be modeled. So we're starting with a pretty long list, and you'll see towards the end, we'll show you some examples and get input, but we are going to try to, or we will get it down to 5 scenarios. Each scenario might be able to answer a few different what if questions because there are different ways of getting at the same question. So we'll get more into the what if scenarios later, but I just wanted to show this as grounding for reference scenario interacting with the alternative scenarios.
Great, thanks, Ruby.
Yeah, do we have any questions, Ruchi, or should we keep going?
No, it tracks really well with what Alan was saying. I think no questions so far.
Cool. All right. So we are now getting into...
Oh, Ruby, it looked like, did John already ask a question? There's a hand up.
Oh.
Oh, thanks. I missed that. Thank you. Go ahead, John.
No, John, jump in.
Thanks, Ben. Just to clarify with the reference scenario, is that like, is the reference like what we're doing today without any decarbonization, or like how does it relate to the policies we have in place that set energy and emissions targets right now?
It's a great question. It's come up in some other spaces, and Ruby, I'm going to pass it to you, but the way that I've been answering it is that yes, it does include current policies, which is, you know, HB 2021, the Climate Pollution Protection Program at DEQ, and then Executive Order 20-04 for sort of whatever's left. And there's a 80% goal in there. Ruby, would you want to expand on that at all?
No, I think that's all correct. And then there are some areas though where policy doesn't get us all the way through 2050. And so there are assumptions going in that will be adding on to current policy. So it includes all current policy plus additional assumptions to get us through 2050. But yeah, it's a good question. I think it's not considered a business as usual case. We're calling it a reference scenario. And then I think, at risk of repeating myself, the reference scenario, everything in the reference scenario is the same in all of those scenarios except for whatever we're testing. So it's really important that's why we're spending a lot of time on the reference scenario assumptions, because those get pulled through all of the scenarios except for whatever is changed to test a certain question.
Cool, thanks so much. So then it ends up being sort of like, it's this experiment, like we've got this one starting way of doing things, and then it's like, what if we did this other thing differently? But they're all with the goal of meeting the targets that we've already set. All right,
exactly.
Cool. Thanks.
They're on it. And I love that you said experiment, because I have also been thinking of it as a high school or middle school science experiment.
Less lava though, please. Less magic lava. Okay, thanks.
It all happens in the computer, don't worry. Okay, moving on then to some of these reference scenario assumptions.
I think we got one more question.
Oh, go for it. Yeah.
Right, just a quick follow-up on that. Is there an assumption of how effective current existing programs will be over time built into that reference scenario? Is it like assumed 100%, or is that a factor?
That is a good question. Yeah, my understanding is that it is assumed 100% effectiveness, which is something that could be tested in an alternative scenario. Like if there's a particular policy that you feel, or that, you know, as a group, people feel really strongly is not going to be implemented effectively, that's something that could be tested in a what if, but the reference scenario would assume full implementation.
Okay, thank you.
Another way to say that is we're modeling success of all of our policies and programs, and then we're testing them based on the scenarios to see what happens if we end up being constrained, or we don't get as much EVs, or we don't get as much heat pumps.
I like the optimism, Alan.
Go ahead, Elaine. I think I saw Elaine's hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, this question of optimism of the scenarios in the study has been raised in a few different of the working groups. I think I just want to remind folks that there's the analysis to look at sort of like how might this all work together from a technology perspective, costs and all of that. And then there's the next phase of the energy strategy where folks will be grappling with how do you think about policy recommendations to get to those successes. And there might be policies and things and options that need to be pursued to help bolster the possibility of success of current policies and of future policies. So I would just say keep thinking about barriers and things that need to be overcome, even if you can't model them in a model like Energy Pathways.
Thanks, Elaine.
Moving on, yeah?
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So you can go to the next slide, Mary. We are going to start to get into some of these specific questions about assumptions in the reference scenario. So we have 3 slides like this with different specific assumptions. You can see the topic on the left and then what the starting point is. This is still all very much in discussion. This is actually the last topic working group. We've had, I don't know how many, 10 over the past 2 weeks. And so there's been a lot of discussion on these already. And yeah, so we wanted to bring out some that seemed most relevant to some of the topics that came up in our last meeting to bring to you all what other groups were discussing and have you all provide some feedback and conversation. So again, this is just a subset of the total list of assumptions. And there also might be things that come up today that we can't quite answer just because we don't have Jeremy, the lead modeler, on, but we're taking careful notes and we'll be happy to follow up. So starting at the top with a few kind of buildings related assumptions, in terms of space heating, we're looking at what targets to set for heat pump sales. And so for residential, there's a target with the Department of Environmental Quality Memorandum of Understanding, the DEQ MOU, for 65% heat pump sales by 2030 and then 90% by 2040. There's not, that doesn't cross over to the commercial side, so that's a question mark. In terms of weatherization, our starting point is from the Oregon Climate Action Commission, weatherizing 95% of existing home envelopes by 2040 for 10 to 20% household energy savings. And so there's a question about if that feels reasonable. For distributed energy resources, we're still investigating some data from the Northwest Power and Conservation Council that we might be able to use around rooftop solar and storage. And then moving to transportation, a couple assumptions that we pulled out were around light duty, medium duty, and heavy duty vehicles transitioning. I'm not going to read through all of those data sources, but there's advanced clean cars, or rather policies, also forecast from the International Council on Clean Transportation. And then for medium duty and heavy duty, there are more questions after 2035, and there was some rich discussion in the transportation working group around that. And then the last transportation one is vehicle miles traveled. The starting point right now is that the VMT per capita would remain constant through 2050 to reflect historical trends. But the Oregon Department of Transportation also has a target of 20% reduction in VMT per capita by 2050. So that's been a point of conversation as well. So I'll pause there. Would love to hear from folks wherever you want to jump in. We don't need to cover each one of these, but whatever is jumping out to people. And I
I'll just-
see Nikita's, oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I
Rucha.
was going to verbalize one in the chat
Yeah, great.
about if 95% increase is compared to current sales. And Elaine answered that it means 65% of people who purchase new heating equipment in 2030 would choose a heat pump, and 90% of people who purchase new heating equipment in 2040 purchase a heat pump. Thanks for that question. Any other thoughts on some of these questions in here? Like the residential one has a pretty, or I mean, the commercial one up top has a pretty big question mark there. And actually, one of the questions I had is whether multifamily housing is counted in sort of residential or commercial. Somebody has that one. And then another question is from Christina about, does the weatherization target include all homes in commercial, not just low income, and what the service delivery vehicle for non-low income might be?
My understanding is it does include all homes. And I don't know, Elaine, if you have anything to add on the service delivery vehicle piece of that question.
No, I don't. I agree with you. I think that's intended to cover all homes, existing commercial and residential homes, and I don't have anything to add on this the service delivery vehicle. Is there? Do you have something to something to say about that you want to share?
Wait, me or Christina?
Christina?
Yeah, I'd love to.
I'll just point out that multifamily homes are considered commercial. So the smaller, like duplexes and quads, are in residential, but everything over that, the larger multifamily is commercial. Because it's a business.
Ruby, is that how it's characterized in energy pathways?
As multifamily being commercial?
Yeah.
I'd have to double check that.
I'd seen it characterized in similar models as residential, so
Okay.
maybe that's something we might want to
Let's
confirm
flag
with
that,
Jeremy and get
sure.
back to this group on.
Yeah, I know that like the way Alan's describing it is definitely how I understand the distinction in building codes, but not sure about this modeling.
Right, right, yeah, and this is about end use demand, and so I think it has more to do with building occupancy than sector of the economy.
Okay, great. And then Christina added.
But we'll confirm. We'll confirm.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Good question to take back. And then Christina added that she didn't have anything to add regarding service delivery of weatherization to non-low income. But Greer had a question about mobile homes that Christina was also wondering about.
So my understanding is mobile homes are included in the entire stock of buildings, but they aren't. We're not going to have results that separate out mobile homes from other types of buildings.
Gotcha. Thank you. And then Sarah was confirming with Alan's point about anything bigger than a duplex is considered commercial. I think that Alan was saying a fourplex, which is how I also understand the distinction between like building codes and when you have to build the code for you following residential code or commercial code. But I think that'll be like part of the circle back on that. Good question. And then Jess was curious if there are any scenarios that have emerged in other groups so far related to new renewable energy projects being developed in Oregon, like offshore wind. Are there any assumptions of how much renewable generation will be built in Oregon and what technologies?
I think the answer is yes to the first one. That's definitely come up in conversation. I don't know if anyone else from Odo wants to comment on that. Potential scenario around offshore wind.
So that probably came up in the energy technologies.
Electricity, yeah.
Okay.
And then in terms of assumptions about how much and what technologies, that would be a result of the modeling, optimizing for how to meet the energy supply at least cost. So the assumptions would be around what the constraints are or data on, cost, or land use, but the actual amount of renewable generation that would be built is going to be a result of the modeling running to produce or to meet the energy demand at least cost. And I guess also on the question of in Oregon versus outside of Oregon, one thing I didn't really highlight in the modeling overview is the fact that in the model, Oregon is very interconnected with the surrounding states in the West. And so there are, I think this is on a later slide actually, but the assumption is that there's one, balancing entity for the West and that there is the ability to share resources. That is something that has come up as a question to potentially explore in a scenario of limiting that, whether by limiting transmission or putting some assumption on the amount that would have to be generated in state. But that's not likely something that would happen in the reference scenario. The reference scenario would be more open, and an alternative scenario might explore a more constrained in-state solution. And Elaine, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to add something on the renewables. I think an exception, a lot of the renewables will be added via optimization, but an exception would be if there's like distributed solar or things or programs that will bring renewables into the state that may not be selected on a purely cost optimal basis, that those can be included in the scenario as well, both to align with like current policies and to explore futures with different amounts of things like distributed generation. So that's something that's, I think, that's maybe an important place to get feedback from this group in particular. And there is also, Ruby mentioned that there can be scenarios, if, for example, if one of the high priority what if scenarios is around transmission and access to resources outside of Oregon or in parts of the state that are hard to reach because of current transmission constraints. If there's a scenario that has tighter transmission constraints, you might actually also see the optimization model building more resources close to loads in Oregon. So that's just something to keep in mind.
So just kind of reflecting back for Jess, you can come in and clarify too. In terms of scenarios emerging in other groups, sounds like lots of interest on like offshore wind as a big example. And so what I'm hearing is that there is an option to have, a scenario where offshore wind is tested as a more likely supply resource. But other than that, the model kind of is selecting for the lowest cost across a west-wide region that, as a, the model thinks is like kind of perfectly collaborating with each other. The phrase is less friction, right? Less transactions, right? Among different balancing authorities. And so that's kind of one thing, Jess, is that I think that, if there was strong interest in testing offshore wind, that would be helpful to hear maybe from this group too. And then on the assumptions of how much renewable energy, I also wanted to add, this came up quite a bit during the land use and natural resource working group. And in that group, there is some effort in using the power of place analysis that looked at different sort of levels of siting where different amounts of land would be excluded from the assumptions of development. And so that would affect how much and also what type. If lands were excluded that are, tend to have high solar resource value, you might see less likelihood of solar then if that land was excluded. So there's it sounds like different types of assumptions that would affect the question of how much renewable energy generation in Oregon. And in terms of that supply, maybe a follow-up for Elaine and Ruby is, will the results show Oregon specific potential supply options? So that would be something to compare across for reference. And so folks who are really interested in, the question of whether there will be more renewable energy development in state can look to that potential result and compare across reference and scenarios. Okay.
Yeah, and it should also be differentiated by whatever the zones are. So the tentative plan on zones is to have the sort of west of Cascades, east of Cascades zones. So you'd be able to differentiate between resource build-outs in those two areas.
Mm-hmm. Great. Any other questions, Jess, or others on this renewable energy question, or I can move us to the VMT question. That's also a really good one.
Jess's hand is raised.
Jess's hand is raised.
Oh, great.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for breaking that down, y'all, and Ruchi for sharing back. That was really helpful. I think that models that show a scenario with and without offshore wind would be extremely helpful. I think something that's what we're really hearing in South Coast communities right now is a question of like how necessary is offshore wind in the broader spectrum of possible energy development in Oregon in order to meet the demands that we know in terms of electricity are going to grow with electrification, but also just existing 2020 HB 2021 commitments. And so that is really playing into community members' minds as they're thinking about, you know, what impacts are folks willing to live with for the sake of climate goals, but also what is really a false solution and not needed in terms of weighing the potential impacts or harms alongside potential benefits for nearby communities, especially coastal and rural communities that will be heavily impacted by this. So I think that scenario would be really beneficial. And then I'm also curious about that as it applies to things like hydrogen, which are already being heavily invested in for the Northwest. And I know that there's already some planning for hydrogen hubs. So I think those kinds of scenarios that would show what's actually on the table would be really beneficial. One quick follow-up question, but I know there's others, so feel free to peel off, is I'm curious if there are other layers in terms of values that will be weighed other than just the economic, like lowest cost or lowest friction on those different technologies.
I think one value that is being weighed is what Ruchi mentioned around land use. So that's a layer that would go into the modeling around specific areas of the state or types of land of the state that could or could not be available for renewable energy build.
And then Ruby, in terms of some of the other values, would we potentially kind of possibly see that in the like energy wallet in terms of consumer cost and then the error modeling too?
Right, and I think that would, yeah, that would be more about interpreting and comparing those results across scenarios rather than constraining on the front end of the model.
Okay. Does that help, Jess? That was a good question. I wanted to.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks. And I would love to know other points or at what point in this broader process it would be great to have more community input on this or CBO input on this, because I think that values filter really matters in terms of what technologies are going to either reinforce inequities or actually reach our climate and climate justice goals specifically.
Great.
I'll jump in here if I can, Ruchi, because Jess asked the question of like where in the process. So we have heard throughout the modeling inputs, people are very interested in things that the model can't tell us. And one of the things that comes up when people talk about different energy resources is what opportunity they might have for things like community resilience. And we'll be really looking early next year when we're having the more policy related discussions to be talking about the things that the model couldn't tell us, but that we have questions about how it might relate to different types of choices in the energy sphere. So keep these things in mind because they will be coming up at a later point in time.
Awesome.
And I think this is a helpful, just to kind of connect the dots here. All of these assumptions around things like distributed generation, offshore wind, customer consumer technology adoption, like what people are choosing to put in their homes and businesses, those are all things that are can be, well, in particular for customer adoption, that it is defined in the model. It's an assumption we're making. And then the values conversation, it happens based on the comparison between the scenarios. The thing that's being solved for is, given your assumptions about each scenario, like what do you build? Because generally utilities and we'll strive to go get the least cost sort of supply to meet those needs. But that doesn't mean that the scenarios are restricted to only whatever we perceive to be least cost today. You can design the scenarios to explore technologies or options that wouldn't naturally fall out of a least cost analysis. And that's one of the useful aspects of this framework.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Elaine. Robert, did you have a kind of like a follow on in this renewable energy space?
Yeah, I did. A lot of my concerns are around what's already been stated, talking about the restrictions, you know, not in my backyard. But the other thing about it is like my utility that I'm on, I can't net meter solar. They've got a moratorium on it. And so how do you guys address those situations where I couldn't put solar on if I wanted on a net meter agreement because of utility policy? And so I guess just asking you to, you know, really look at that, you know, I think there's more set policies for your investor-owned utilities, but on your member-owned utilities, your co-ops and your PUDs, there's other restrictions and these utilities cover a large area of the state, but we're kind of on two different playing fields when we talk about rooftop solar and those things. So that's kind of one area of concern for me. The other is storage aspect and thinking about resiliency such, and just trying to, I think, encourage more on-site storage for the resiliency side of things and such. But those kind of the comments I had on the rooftop solar and storage.
That's really helpful. I'm curious, Ruby or Elaine or others, in terms of this like target for rooftop solar and storage using data from the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. So like on one end, there's sort of like the policy conversation about net metering and statutory caps and whether specific utilities go beyond those caps or if the cap changes. That's, I think, policy conversation. But is there something around the assumptions for targets of rooftop solar that's informed by the way net metering policy currently stands?
You want to take that, Elaine?
I mean, what I would say is that the rooftop solar, the approach is not to try to estimate how many customers will adopt rooftop solar based on what they have, what their options are available today, but instead to say, what if this many customers were to adopt rooftop solar going forward, and how would that affect the composition of all the energy infrastructure and everything? And so this is a place where it might be useful to have, you know, this model doesn't get you into like a lot of specifics in any one area, but it might be useful to have scenarios that explore a wide difference between sort of local solar and more reliance on further away, you know, big solar, just to sort of tease out and understand what the differences are for customers and what the differences are for sort of like how much transmission is needed at a high level, not, you know, detailed transmission analysis, but you might be able to get some of those things. The way to do it would be to design scenarios, because like I said, it's not going to forecast for you what customers do given current rate designs or net metering options or programs.
So that would be like if there was interest in sort of teasing out some benefits of more rooftop solar, you would maybe have a scenario that has way more DERs, like a high sort of DER, and then you would maybe see some outcomes that are like, well, now we're saving some money on transmission, or there's some resilience benefit or something. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
You could do that, or if there's sort of general alignment that more DERs would be better, you could also just sort of put a blanket assumption across all of the scenarios and then use other aspects of the process to dig into how do you get that, or what are the implications. So the energy wild analysis, for example, could look at a customer who has access to solar and one who doesn't, and what their cost could be. That's one of the types of sort of dimensions you could explore through these after the fact analyses.
Okay. And so, Robert, it sounds like your question around differentiated you know, rate design and net metering policies in different utilities might be a good conversation for the policy conversation piece, but there are pieces in this model that might be really informative. I think that Energy Wallet one was a really good example. Did you have any other follow-up on that, Robert, or others on the sort of renewable energy? Otherwise, I'd like to move to Caleb's really good point in the chat about VMT and transportation. Okay, I'm going to move us, but if there's other topics or questions that come up around what surfaced from what Jess first put in the chat, and I think a really good conversation, I'd welcome that. So Caleb asked, VMT is likely to remain high in rural areas compared to urban centers, and the fundamentals built into that aren't likely to change. Public transportation is non-existent in a lot of communities, and people don't have a lot of options other than to drive 20 or 30 miles to grocery stores, workplaces, etc. Scaling the VMT reduction geographically may be worth considering. There were a few other areas of interest there from others in the group.
Yeah, I really appreciate this comment. Just from the modeling perspective, I don't think that we're able to scale the VMT reduction geographically. And so I think that we would take this comment into account in terms of the overall starting point. And that's, is it right, Caleb, that would align with what is currently on the slide there for the starting point, the assumed to remain constant versus if we switch to the target of the 20% reduction?
Yeah, I
Could you
mean,
add any more color to that?
it just seems like any investment made in public transit generally is made in places where there are just more people to be able to use it. Like right now, I am 20 miles from the nearest grocery store or gas station, and I'm closer than a lot of people I know. And that's just the fundamental that's built into most of the outlying communities in rural Oregon. You know, the amount of miles that you're going to have to travel day to day are not going to shift based on rollout of increased public transportation. It would be a bad investment to have a bus route that I could jump onto to get to the grocery store, right? So just somehow taking that into account. If it's not in this modeling, then definitely in our policy conversations next year. My concern is just that if we assume that people will be driving less statewide, that assumption is going to be flawed, because in eastern and rural Oregon, that's just not going to be the case. There's no other option for people.
Yeah, thank you for articulating that.
One further point on VMT. So VMT is a good transportation metric, and it's really critical in the urban areas in particular for congestion and quality of life issues. Where if we reduce VMT, those would go up. But VMT is not a very good climate and energy metric for a bunch of reasons, primarily because as the CAFE standards, miles per gallon standards go up, cars become more efficient, and we could have VMT go up and emissions go down. Or EVs, every time we buy a new EV and it displaces a fossil fuel car, we get reductions in greenhouse gases, but it's not related at all to VMT. So so every increment of EVs that we get reduces, it has a lower and lower reduction in energy use and emissions. So VMT is tricky when it comes to energy and greenhouse gases as a metric. And eventually, when we have all EVs and they're all using electricity, that's not going to be a very good metric at all.
Yeah, and I guess on that point, Alan, the cost to the person who's doing the driving, I guess, is my concern. If it's assumed that they're going to be driving less, whether that's a diesel or gasoline powered vehicle or an EV or, God forbid, an H2FC vehicle. If it's assumed the miles will get lower, then the assumption is probably not going to reflect the reality of how much that is coming out of their pockets to provide for that. Thanks for the explanation.
There's also one kind of interesting thing that comes out of these pathways studies as it relates to VMT, I'd say, or any sort of energy services demand, which is that if you're not able to reduce those things in some way, so for example, you're not able to do weatherization either, the amount of physical infrastructure you have to build can go up a lot, right? The amount of renewables that you need to decarbonize the energy that you're using to serve all those end uses goes up. So you save infrastructure, you save money, and you save land use by doing things like trying to reduce VMT where you can and doing weatherization and all of that. So instead of thinking about, oh, we're using less fossil fuels in a decarbonized world, it's no longer you're using less fossil fuels, it's we're having to build less stuff, build on less land, build less infrastructure, and save some money. So that's just something that you'll see in this type of study that you might not see in a study that isn't sort of carbon constrained and doesn't look at the entire economy altogether.
Great. And I saw Mariah's comment about average commute could be included in the geomapping approach. So that might be something to follow up on after this sort of like reference scenario discussion too. Anything else on VMT? That was a pretty good conversation on that. Okay, well, I'm going to kind of move us through the chat. I know there's 2 more slides that we want to make sure that you all see. And so Nikita asked about whether space heating in residential commercial buildings piece include the building performance standard that Odo is developing, which is based on ASHRAE 100. My understanding is yes. I think that it does include the assumption of the BPS going through. I don't see Alan shaking his head no, so I'm going to say yes. And then Sarah's question about whether mobile homes are included in residential. If that's a quick yes, no, I think I see Elaine nodding yes, it is. Thanks, Sarah, for following up on that. Ale asked about what about avoided costs that may reflect societal benefits in terms of what Jess was asking about the value filter.
Is the question whether there will be avoided costs for non-energy things sort of included in the optimization?
Yeah, just ways that we could capture non-energy benefits and just societal benefits in, I don't do modeling, but I'm thinking just like in a way that could fit in the model. And it's like, okay, well, if we don't have to pay, if we're kind of mitigating climate change, there's less wildfires, these are avoided costs that we have. And these are also benefits that come from those pieces in regards to our investments in different energy, the energy systems.
That's a great call out, and I think that's something we can take back to Jeremy to check on the what the options are in energy pathways. I know in general, if you can convert something into a cost, that you can do sort of a cost reduction for different technologies. It can be very complicated, and so I don't know what the sort of full space of things that Jeremy can do on that front. But what I will say is that I think the way that the study's been designed is with the intention to have you be able to look at those sorts of things on the outputs. So maybe the big infrastructure that's being added is being optimized for cost, but you'll get to see on the outputs what the differences are in terms of health impacts and things that are like different than just cost. So even if it's not optimizing for those things, you'll be able to see differences, and that the intention is that will inform the policy conversation. But it is a question I think we might. I don't know, Ruby, have you seen Evolved incorporate sort of benefits reflecting like non-energy things in other pathway studies?
I have not, aside from the added, well, I guess that's still not optimized, but the health analysis through Cobra.
So it's like an after the fact. It's always been sort of an after the fact. Yeah, as opposed to
I think
bringing it in.
To speak for Jeremy for just a moment, it would also have to rely on a publicly available verifiable data source. So that's another aspect of the complexity of like, how do you translate those
quantifiable or non-energy benefits into quantifiable metrics. But I agree that we could take this back and talk through a little bit more internally.
I'm also hearing in Ole's question and also in John's comment in the chat here on ice storms, a differentiation maybe between like valuing non-energy benefits, but then also whether or not there are assumptions baked into the reference case on the cost to infrastructure or the cost around infrastructure for, you know, things that cost a lot, like undergrounding transmission lines to deal with ice storms or power shutoffs because of wildfire, which are two examples in recent news. And whether or not there's something maybe around like assumptions for cost for some of those utility questions that need to be embedded. Is that Ale and John, some of the maybe like more energy specific valuation questions that could be part of that?
Yeah, 100%. I think that's on the right track for how we're thinking about it. For instance, with the purposeful like power shutoffs, they a lot of the times they happen during the hottest times of the years, right? And so even though these are used for wildfire mitigation, their impacts may still be very detrimental to the community if there is not other investments in the community, such as like solar and storage or other types of reliable energy that they could use during these times, so that there's wildfire mitigation, but that there's also like local community solutions for people to not then, you know, continue to have these kind of negative impacts on them in some of the most like dire weather conditions, right? And so what are these ways that we could calculate in a model to show PSPS and these types of wildfire mitigation strategies may be expensive. And so let's also look at other solutions that we need to be investing in to then hopefully be able to phase out those things that aren't actually real solutions for our communities.
Gotcha.
I think this is a tough one for a like a model that kind of is necessarily very broad because the questions you're raising are they have so much complexity to them and they're very local. And I think that it might be tempting to say, well, these scenarios, you know, we don't know how the different energy infrastructure built out in these scenarios will affect wildfires, but you can look at the types of things that are in the scenarios and be like thoughtful and use some critical thinking to think about, okay, like what if I like try to envision this energy world, because these are going to be like different worlds in terms of energy by the time you get to the end of the study timeline here. If I envision that energy world, like what do we do during a wildfire? Like who's going to be most vulnerable? Have we added a bunch of transmission across the Cascades that now we have to think about maybe we're more vulnerable during some of those parts of the summer, things like that. And so I think even if it can't be addressed in the model, those are really helpful lenses to be viewing the results through so that you can think about what policies need to sort of complement those paths, if that helps. So it's kind of, it might not be very satisfactory in building out the model that you can't answer those questions in detail.
Thanks, Elaine. I see Robert and John have their hands up. I think on this topic, so I'll pass it to John and then Robert.
Yeah, thanks. I think Ale pretty much said 95% of what I was gonna say, but one thing I wanted to add as a potential like specific scenario would be something along the lines of like, yeah, like lots of people are talking about building massive transmission lines from eastern to western Oregon, but can we compare that to the costs of like and benefits of if a bunch of folks get rooftop solar and storage on the west side and like the added resilience benefits? I mean, lots of people in Portland lost power for like a whole week last winter during the storm, and I'm wondering if you can quantify like the health benefits of being able to rely on local backup power rather than just being totally dependent on a grid that might go down. So yeah, I guess yeah, I'm trying to envision like what Ali was saying and how you could put it into a reference scenario. Does that feel like that might give you some stuff you could work with?
Okay, so what I'm hearing is interest in having in the reference scenario sort of like build out of infrastructure, sort of local infrastructure that supports community resiliency during these extreme events. And I think the granularity of the model is such that that might not be the type of thing you can like test the value of looking at different scenarios, because we don't have the granularity to say like whether or not that is a good idea, but you can have a conversation about it and you can put it in the model and you can see like what else gets built out if you assume that that stuff gets developed to support local communities and resiliency. So I think that's the type of input that we're looking for in building out these scenarios. I don't know if Oda has anything to add on that.
Cool. And sorry, just to correct one thing, I didn't mean I said in reference scenarios. What I meant is if there was like an alternative scenario that had high level of like community-based DERs, stuff like that. Thanks.
Yeah, just to follow up on that. So, we have a limited budget, so we can do several scenarios. We'll try to combine as much as we can into these scenarios to capture all of this. And again, the model doesn't give you the answer, it just illuminates kind of trade-offs. When we get to the policy part of this phase of doing the energy strategy in next year, after we've got the model results back, that's when we start coming up with what does the strategy look like and what are the recommendations going to look like. I think it's helpful to think of the recommendations in kind of three buckets. One, what are we doing now that we need to do more of? And like, we need to do a hell of a lot more heat pumps. And then secondly, what are we not doing now that we need to do, kind of new stuff? And then the third bucket is, what don't we know and what do we need to study or research in order to be able to help us meet the end goal of the strategy over time? So there's a kind of like the research bucket. So, existing, new, and research bucket. And a lot of the stuff that some people have been talking about, for instance, when you start talking about doing all these heat pumps, well, embedded in that, that's the what, but how you do it's really important. That's the policy side. So, you might just say, okay, address all the equity issues by having every low-income person get a heat pump first, and then you address the equity questions. Obviously, that's not very politically sustainable or doable, but that's the how part, and that's the policy part of the conversations that we're going to have once we get the information out of the models.
I think I saw Robert's hand, and then I'm going to sort of go through some of the chat comments and move us along to the other slides because we just want to make sure we share the rest of the information in here as well. Robert, did you still have your hand up?
Yeah, kind of two questions. One, it's more on the wildfire part, the discussion there. And at the last meeting, it was actually kind of a surprise to me when we talked about air quality and everybody was talking about wildfire smoke. Like, I think throughout Oregon, that's our biggest air quality issue, and we're all dealing with it right now, and we've been dealing with it for the last couple of months every summer. And so, I guess my question is, it ties to energy on that. I mean, are we evaluating like the forest health, the biomass projects that then could be used for energy? Will this model help us look at some of those opportunities there? Everything from burning orchard waste to field burning to these large forest fires we have and the biomass potential behind it. To me, there's a connection there, but it just seems that it's not being I haven't heard a lot about that. Air quality conversations I'm hearing is more about emissions through vehicles and those types of items. But I think there's in my own opinion, from what we face in Central and Eastern Oregon, is this wildfire smoke is real. It's all summer long, and it's our major air quality issue. So that's one. Don't have to answer. My second thought on this, and it has to do with the transmission lines and this barrier and challenge from getting, we've got all the commercial wind and renewables going in here in Central and Eastern Oregon, but all of our loads on, a large percentage of the loads on the I-5 corridor. Is this model, I mean, would it help us at all by saying, hey, what if we moved these large load demands from I-5 corridor to Central and Eastern Oregon, and instead of putting transmission lines in, move the use to the source of power? Is this model gonna help us? We've seen that in Oregon with the dairies. They move the dairies to where the hay is. Instead of hauling hay, it's cheaper to haul the milk. We used to have the aluminum plants at the base of the Dalles Dam and John Day Dam, those big power demands at the source. And so I'm just wondering, will this model help us look at some of those scenarios?
That's a great question. I think that there's also a question in the chat about data centers, if they're included in the modeling. My understanding, and Ruby, correct me if I'm wrong here, is that they're included as an industrial load, and that the data center load forecast is one of the places where we're actively working to try to get some reasonable assumptions. Like I said before, with the zonal treatment, we do have the ability to differentiate between loads that are built out west and east of the Cascades. And so that's a really interesting question that might be worth delving into, is thinking about where that load is going to show up.
Thanks, Elaine. And even if we're not able to answer some of these good points and questions in real time, Robert and others, thank you for asking them. We're definitely noting them down and have a chance to sort of circle back with Jeremy and others on some of them. I want to move us to the next few slides. I know Ramphis had a question around family sustaining careers. Did you want to do that as the last one on this one, and so we can move to the other ones, other slides in here? I know that hasn't come up yet, so Ramphis, if you want to, are you still there?
Sure. Yeah. So sorry for being late on this one, but as we're talking about scenario planning for different load demands, like, to me, load demands is also tied to economic development and jobs. And I think as we're talking about deployment of different technologies and strategies to meet our state energy plans, it's kind of difficult to not make a distinction there between jobs and family jobs. And I think one of the key interests of mine on this one is just knowing, like, as we think about the different scenarios, the opportunities to sort of further examine workforce equity pipelines for family sustaining jobs. Like, I don't think I want to go too deep in, but in the clean energy sector, I think there could be done a much better job of making sure pathways to careers are created that's more inclusive than they have historically been, and that they're family sustaining. So it's not meant to be a juxtaposition to any of the different scenarios plotted out here, but it's meant to be, like, within these scenarios, what is the sort of additional lens or things that we can learn? Because I think we talk about it from a load perspective or how we're going to meet our energy needs perspective, but it's difficult not to think about family jobs. And I don't think I need to belabor the point for other parts of Oregon where family sustaining jobs is a critical consideration as we think about our energy goals in the future.
Great.
Really helpful comment. Thank you. I don't know, Richie, if you were going to say the same thing, but this wasn't included in this presentation, but we're working on, or Odo is working on a separate workforce analysis that would layer on top. So that would be another thing that could come out of the energy modeling results, is actually looking at the jobs impacts related to potentially the reference scenario compared to other scenarios. And that would include information about wage and other, more qualitative job quality type discussions. So really, really helpful comment. Thank you, Ramphis.
Great. Yeah. And if I may, and I won't go too much more longer, I think that would be great to know and see the scope. And then I think where it falls short around, threading the needle here on workforce equity and diverse business opportunities. Like that's an area like knowing ahead of time where that might fall short or we might need resources. That would be helpful to know, because I think it's good to get the jobs analysis piece. That's great, but I think the inclusion is the key part, I think, of interest to highlight. Sorry.
That's okay. No, thanks for saying that. I'll just add, Ramphis, I think that is spot on. And I think a big reason why there's some interest in doing some supplementary analysis, so that we can move into those policy conversations with a better understanding of where there might be, potential gaps to fill or other policy solutions to talk about. I'm going to move us forward, but just know, Ramphis and others, that there's going to need to be a follow up with Mary and a few others on the sort of secondary analysis on getting deeper on the sort of economic and jobs piece with an overlay of what we're seeing from the model. I'm going to move us to the next few slides, but I also wanted to say that we've been seeing some of the chats on some of the questions. So there's a few questions in here that were answered in the chat. One was from Jess around technologies not being equal in potential adverse impacts on communities. And I offered that there is some analysis happening with the Land Use and Natural Resources Working Group, which is considering the power of place analysis on different levels of excluded land that could be available for energy development based on habitat, land use, and natural resource protections. It's not all the potential impacts. I don't think there's a ton of analysis on community impacts, which may differentiate, be different in different locations. But it's a great point, and something to, I think, continue to talk about. The other question around consumer choices being modeled from Mark has a response in the chat from Jessica on the question about how consumer choices will be modeled. And the model doesn't get into that level of granularity, but understanding specific concerns and issues of energy technologies is definitely ripe for conversation in the policy discussions as well. So the last one here I wanted to verbalize was from Greer around education, and Lauren answered that education is going to be a big, an important part of the process, and something we can begin to address even before the energy strategy. And would love to think about ways we can collect more information from communities on what materials and resources might be helpful, and get your ideas on that as well. I'm going to move us to the next slide here, but please continue to use the chat if other questions come up. And even if we don't get to them today, we're collecting all of them and wanting to answer them. So next slide, Mary. Thank you. We covered some of this, but making sure that we kind of hit the points and then kind of move forward. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ruby.
No, I was just going to say the same thing. We've actually touched on a lot of this by now. So siting and land use is one topic, with what Ruchi was talking about, power of place being a potential data source there. Energy production, we talked about the whether energy would be produced in Oregon or outside of Oregon. And then on pollution and air quality, there was a question I just wanted to clarify. It came up last meeting, and indoor air quality is not part of the COBRA model, so that wouldn't be included. Where you could make connections to indoor air quality would be around assumptions about electrification of cooking, heating, and other appliances in buildings, but it's not going to be one of the outputs. And then wildfire impacts and smoke, Robert also brought that up. And then next slide, the other two topics I wanted to touch on are reliability, which is enforced through the energy modeling, and then climate change impacts. We're working with the Northwest Power and Conservation Council to potentially incorporate some work on climate change impacts to hydro availability. And then another way that that's incorporated into the data set is around changing service demand. So for example, growth in number of air conditioning units. So just a couple ways that some of these topics that were brought up are incorporated into the reference scenario. And next slide. I think I want to make sure that Lauren has time for the important conversation at the end here. So let's just run through. Mary, you can go to the next. Just pause here for a second. I think it's important for understanding how these what if questions get translated to scenarios. So I think people have been kind of getting it because people are already talking about certain what if scenarios. But if you ask a question like, what if consumer adoption of heat pumps occurs more slowly, then for example, your reference scenario might say 100% sales of heat pumps by 2030, and your alternative scenario might lower that to 50% by 2035 and through 2050. And then next slide. This is a list of some example what if scenarios that have come up in other working groups. So I don't think we're going to spend too long on this, but this is also something that we'll be asking for feedback in the final working group meeting, in that August 22 meeting with everyone, and very much open to written comment before then as well. But these are some to get you thinking, and then yeah, very curious to hear if any of these are rising to the top, and if there are some that are not on this list that should be added, some that were already brought up in this meeting. And yeah, I think if no one has any burning questions, we can move to Lauren and kind of zoom out and talk more about process. But thank you all for such great engagement. Really, really helpful.
Okay, thanks everyone. I think, Mary, sorry, you can go to the next slide. I think that this conversation that we're having right now and the depth that people are getting into really speaks to our next conversation and the potential need for more time together to continue to unpack all of this and to contribute, you know, give ideas, ask questions. The questions are really helpful for us to dig down into, you know, a little bit deeper. So we heard you last time that more engagement, more time together might be helpful. So I put together a very quick little menu here that you can like or not like. I'm not married to anything. But here I've got some options around what we can do more recently, like a topic specific meeting that we could potentially hold in September or October. And that could be used to better unpack the energy wallet, air quality, geospatial mapping, things like that, that have a little bit of a later timeline. We could host something like office hours, and this might look like an hour to drop in where folks can come together, ask questions, get into more of the technical aspects of the work, hear about where we are in the process, provide comments or feedback, or also have conversations with each other. And then in the spring, when we begin the policy conversations, I'm curious if people are interested in a working group similar to this one with the policy focus. And if so, what does that look like to you? Would you like to meet more often than just these 2 times? And then the last thing is I feel like there still might be more that folks want to say about the model before August 31st. And of course, you're always welcome to, you know, provide comments. But I'm also curious if folks want to meet one time before August 31st. So if you want to come back together again as a group one more time, then we can work to find that as well. And if there's something that I haven't named, I would love to hear about that too. And I think for this part, Mary, if you want to take the slide down, that's totally fine. Yeah, thanks. So maybe I'll, oh, sorry, was someone going to come off mute?
I was just going to say, Lauren, I'm getting, Nikita made a comment that it's difficult to answer the question around which of these are the highest priority as far as interests in the what ifs that would inform the scenarios. And it would be helpful to have more sideboards around this question, more guidance on how to prioritize them would be helpful for the aims of the strategy. Lots of plus signs in favor of that and people interested in more engagement around that. So I just wanted to flag that for you.
Perfect. And I'm also seeing, Christina, that another meeting prior to August 31st would be helpful. And maybe we could use that to get more into those what ifs, so that we can have more conversation and get more in depth. Because I know, yeah, y'all are doing so much good work that it's hard to pack it all into 2 hours.
I'll also flag, Lauren, that John from Spark Northwest wanted to know if he could get a little more material to comment on, like sample graphics or text from similar reports. And I think we can do that. There's a lot of things that are similar to this, but then I also want to flag Oregon, as we all know, is unique. And all of the communities in Oregon are unique. And so this is going to, I think, require a lot of thinking on our part in how we can approach the modeling and then the policy questions that are more Oregon specific. So I just want to caution, while we can provide those for you, that it's not going to be a direct one-to-one.
Francis, I see your comment too, that it would be helpful to know what the root problem, the nuclear what if, is trying to solve. And it sounds like, again, like this might need a bigger conversation around the what if piece. And so we can absolutely put that together.
Yeah, if I can just chime in here, 2 cents. Like if the root problem you're trying to solve here with this question is like some kind of generation to meet certain demand that's of high volume, then I think probably framing that more of the question than specifically nuclear, because nuclear is just very specific and obviously a hot button issue. So it's better to know the root concern or the root problem you're trying to solve versus just framing it from nuclear, if that makes sense. So if there were other options, like it would be interesting to know again, rather than just one specific type of technology.
Might try to, if I could try, Lauren, one of the ways I've been thinking about it, and others chime in, and I see Nikita's question too about, do scenarios include multiple what ifs, which maybe Ruby you can help with. But the way I've been thinking about it in piece is that there's sort of like this ideal that we meet our policy objectives in the reference case, and there's different ways to meet them. And we want to sort of test out some different ways they might be met to understand the results. And that will lead to policy conversations. So to me, it's almost like, what can we unearth through the experiment that would help inform policy conversations? So some examples, we see a result where there's really high costs for certain consumers in the energy wallet. A policy conversation around some sort of bill or rate relief might be really topical for that policy conversation. So it's just like one example that I've been thinking about to sort of inform. We could do lots of what ifs, but which ones might help to unearth information to help inform a policy conversation? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, that's helpful. But again, if it's like we're exploring nuclear because it generates something of the magnitude of something that's measured in hundreds of megawatts to gigawatts, and that's why, because of the short timeline, then I would say, well, why not consider other technologies in that what if scenario? I know like offshore wind's another one that's, I would say, is probably another hot topic one. But again, if it's like the urgent need to meet something, it's better to know why and couch those conversations together, because I think you'll get, I likely imagine you'll get a certain response about nuclear. You'll likely get a certain response from offshore wind anyway, but if we know what the problem is that you're trying to explore in the what if, that's where I'm kind of encouraging. Maybe you lump a couple key technologies that meet a certain goal outcome, so it could be discussed in comparatively, in contrast, what are the potential outcomes. But helpful framing, again, I think it's just, again, helpful. My 2 cents is just not just keeping it nuclear, because I think it becomes the nuclear option here.
Thank you. Ruby or Jessica, do you want to weigh in on Nikita's? I think I'm trying to get to people to understand sort of like some of the, we're asking you what ifs do you have, and trying to help surface like some of those sideboards around what kind of what ifs might be.
Can I add one consideration for people trying to think about good what ifs and how to prioritize them, which is that there is a ton of technological uncertainty across the horizon that this study is going to look at. And so like the paths that are explored in this study will necessarily change. Like if you look at it again in 5 years and were to redo this analysis with all the new information, like it'll look very different. So I always like to think about these long-term modeling exercises as like what's most important to inform the things we have to decide on in the near term. And so that might be a helpful lens. There is a challenge with providing reliability in a very low carbon future. We do not know yet how we're going to do that. There are a lot of technology options on the table, and the Energy Pathways model will help us see how some of the different technology options solve that problem in different ways. But what can we learn that will help inform the near-term decisions and tough calls that have to be made? And so that's just one way to try to think about prioritizing.
And I can just add, when you're talking about different ways that maybe we could combine 2 what ifs to do a single scenario. One of the areas that I noticed this group is actually very cross all of the different energy technologies, but a lot of other groups are not. And you find that like the transportation fuels folks, they tend to be very sequestered around discussions around those fuels, and electricity folks tend to be very sequestered around those things. So, but you can see like one of the things we're hearing is, well, what if we can't move to more electrified end uses like electric vehicles and heat pumps, because the electric transmission system isn't able to achieve those levels of electrification. And then from the transportation side, we might hear questions about, well, what if EVs aren't workable in certain scenarios, or if we can't get medium and heavy duty vehicles all into an electric vehicle as early as we think we will, then what are the other options for that? And there's alternative fuels out there that aren't electricity that can be relied on. Those are 2 things that could probably be merged into a single scenario. And those 2 groups don't usually talk to each other. So that's just an example that my team's going to work on when we get all of this feedback from you and the other working groups, to think about how we could overlay those and then talk to the people at CETI and the modeler to see if we can do those kinds of things. So we will be working on that, and there probably are a lot of ways we can combine the what ifs into different scenarios, but time will tell after we start working on them how successful we are in that.
One more thing I'd add, Jessica, I really liked that framing. There's also like if you're only changing one thing, there are still multiple questions that could be answering. Like you could be answering the question of, what if you incentivize local economic development and local job creation, and what if you limit transmission? And both of those might have the same effect of increasing renewable energy generation in the state. So there's kind of different ways you can get at the same lever that you're changing in the model, as well as different levers that you can combine in the way that Jessica was explaining.
I see that we're a minute away from that time. And so I'm going to move us along, but I think that if you have questions around the what ifs before we meet on the 22nd, please do send them my way, and I will work to get them answered as quickly as possible so that you feel prepared going into that conversation. Mary, do you want to pop the slides back up? We can wrap up here in 30 seconds. So our next meeting will be August 22nd from 1 to 3 p.m. This is going to be with all of the different working groups. So be prepared for that. And then lastly, just back to the further engagement, I'm going to send out a survey to y'all and figure out a time and how and where and when you would prefer to meet and how you would like to meet. And then we'll go from there. So thank you all very, very much. I really appreciate your contributions today and the time and expertise that you've given to the conversation. And this isn't the last of it. Plenty more still to go. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.